Hi everyone, Stepan here. It's Friday, so welcome to another Friday Middlegame video. Today I wanted to talk about provoking weaknesses in your opponent's position, a subject that's often overlooked when looking at the strategy of the middle game, and something that strong players do probably subconsciously, that they try to find ways to provoke weaknesses, because once you have a target, once you have something to play against, then it becomes easier to form plans. You start spending way less time, and well, generally it becomes easier to play for you than for your opponent. Now, there is no one way to do this. It's going to depend on the openings you play, on the middle games you get from your openings, and there are patterns in each opening, and I would advise you to look at games in the openings that you play and try to see what strong players do to create weaknesses and targets. I've chosen two games which I think are quite different. One of them is easy to understand and the weaknesses are quite apparent. The other one is very hard to understand and the weaknesses are harder to exploit, harder to notice, and harder to play against. And also the weaknesses are something that Black, in this case, decides to get when he chooses the opening. So the first game was played in 1950, so not the highest quality, but still some of the best players in the world. Isaac Boleslavsky played Salomon Floor in the Candidates, which was played in Budapest. And we have this closed Roy position, closed Spanish position. Now there are a million moves Black could choose here: knight b8 the Breyer, knight a5 the Chigorin, you could play rook e8, you could play h6. In this position Salomon Floor played bishop to e6, which is the Kolmov variation. And not that popular today because White has sort of an easy game. This is a very unpopular move today. But a good example of creating weaknesses. So d4 by White, which is the main theoretical move. Bishop takes b3. White was threatening d5. Queen takes b3, and now e takes d4, c takes d4. In this position, c takes d4 is the main move. Now Black could choose between two options. One of them is d5, allowing White to create a strong center. The other option that's only been played a few times but is better is sort of a Chigorin plan with knight a5, queen c2, c5, and going for knight c6, rerouting your knight back to the center. It's clear that the knight on c6, as in many other closed Spanish positions, is not an ideal piece, so we want to move it away either to the king side to g6 and f4, or via a5 to c6. As we can see in the Breyer, Black often plays knight b8 voluntarily. But in this position, Salomon Floor chose to play d5, and now of course you don't break the central tension, you play the move e5, gaining more space, and the knight is basically forced to e4. And now this is still theory, so I don't want to discuss this position too much, but if you had to say which are the weakest points in the Black position, then obviously the c6 knight is undefended, it could become a target. The c7 pawn is a backward pawn, it's not going to have an easy time moving forward because the c5 square is defended. For now the knight and the bishop on e7 are controlling c5, so if Black is given time, he could very well continue with knight a5 and c5 and then break the position open, in which case White would have a weakness on e4. But it's White to play. And also, I should mention the a6 pawn is weak for the moment. So White continues with knight c3, challenging the knight, threatening to win the d5 pawn. So of course, if you continue with knight a5, then queen d5. So Black basically has to take on c3. And now you don't take with the pawn, sort of as one guy I know tends to do, often making the pawn chain beautiful. That's just aesthetic. You don't want to deactivate your pieces for something that's, well, aesthetic. So in this case, queen takes c3. And of course now that puts pressure on the c6 knight, it indirectly puts pressure on the c7 pawn. The queen is also closer to the king side, and Black has to defend, so queen to d7. Now this position is still okay for Black. White should be slightly better, but nothing major. And White continues with bishop to d2, developing his last piece. We have knight to d8, and this now prepares to, well, it moves the knight so that the knight could switch to the king side if need be to e6 or something, and it also prepares to defend the c7 pawn. So knight d8 is a good move. Knight e6 would sort of get rid of two weaknesses at once. And white plays a very active move here. Since the black knight went to d8, white plays the move bishop to g5, trying to trade off black's most active piece, the piece that's controlling the c5 square, so basically making c5 very hard to play. And in this position, the exchange happens, bishop g5, knight g5. And now if you look at the position, this is a position filled with permanent weaknesses for black. The first weakness is the c7 pawn, which is now very hard to liquidate. If you play c5, I'm going to take it. Also, the black king is sort of compromised because of the g5 knight. As we know, the combination of queen and knight can be deadly, and a move such as queen d3 will inevitably provoke a weakness. You will have to defend the h7 square. So already in this position we can see that despite black being the one having weaknesses in his position, he is about to have more unless he's careful. So the best way for black to play here, which wasn't played in the game, was to try to choose the lesser evil move, sort of, and try to make a weakness that's manageable. So h6, simply chasing the knight away, and after knight f3 you continue with knight e6, and knight e6 defends the king, controls f4, controls g5, attacks the d4 weakness in white's position, because this pawn is weak. It also prepares c5 if black ever wishes to do that. It defends the c7 pawn and sort of gets rid of most of the issues. Instead of that, after knight takes g5, c6 was played, and c6 is a target for the rest of the game. The knight, if it gets to e6, will not be defending c7 because the pawn is on c6, and white can now pile up on the pawn. So this is a weakness, this is a weakness, the king is a weakness. So rook a to c1, making it very hard for black to move the knight. Of course, if the knight moves in this position, then queen takes c6. So rook to c8, and there was no other way to defend c6, but now another weakness is highlighted, and by playing rook a to c1, white provoked a weakness on a6 and highlighted the weakness on a6. So this pawn is now very hard to defend, and if you play a5, I'm going to take it. If you don't do anything, I'm going to attack the pawn. So in this position, before moving on, white decides to create another weakness. Since h6 hasn't been played, you now have time to weaken black's position further. So for the moment, there are two very obvious weaknesses, a6 and c6. By playing his next move, white creates another one, queen to d3. Now we have two options, no more than that. You either have to play g6 or f5, otherwise you get mated. You could play rook e8, but maybe you don't get mated, but you lose a ton of material. So g6 was played in the game. If f5, then you don't take en passant. You simply win a pawn. You play the move queen to a3, and now it's very hard to defend the pawn. The a6 pawn is weak, and also the h7 pawn is weak. You cannot defend both. Of course, if the queen defends with something like queen to b7, you could continue with e6, but you could also consider moves like knight takes h7, when if the king takes, then just take the rook for free. But probably best if queen b7 is e6 and dominant position for white. For example, b4, trying to get the queen away from the rook. You could continue with queen d3, still looking at a6. If, for example, rook c7, then you could consider moves like rook e5. And, of course, this knight isn't doing anything. Okay, instead of that, g6 was played, and I would say that this is even worse, because now knight h7 is even more powerful. Of course, yeah, in the previous position, when f5 was played, knight h7 was defended by the queen. So queen to a3 played in the game. Now defending a6 is impossible. If you try queen to b7, then knight takes h7 and black can safely resign. If you don't take the knight, knight f6 leads to probably a very quick checkmate. If you play rook e8, saving the rook, which is the only move, then knight f6, you just win a whole rook. Or you could try to checkmate, but probably taking the rook is correct. So after queen a3, black just loses a pawn, so knight e6, and of course you don't drop your knight, you take first. f6, queen a6, and now white is simply winning. c6 is a weakness, e6 is a weakness, g6 is a weakness, the king is weak, and by highlighting black's weaknesses and creating further weaknesses, white managed to get a winning position in the first 20 moves. In this position, if rook a8, queen c6, rook c6, rook a2, and you can pick up the pawn on e6, so you cannot really exploit the positioning of the white queen. Queen f7 played, looking to attack f2. Of course, now f3 would be a weakening move because of queen f4 and getting into the position, but now simply rook f1 and everything is defended. You don't want to create dark squared weaknesses. Rook a8 played here, but now queen c6, rook a2, queen b5, and we don't have to look any further. This is just an obviously lost position for black, 2 pawns down, and white has a passed pawn on b2. So I think this is a very good example of how one weakness leads to another, and how a strong player doesn't try to win against one weakness before creating additional weaknesses, if that's in any way possible. So after bishop to g5, black is of course still okay. After takes, knight takes. Now black has to play carefully. As I said, h6, knight e6, and his position is okay. Still he is worse because the c7 weakness is harder to defend than the weakness on d4, but he could hold the position. Okay, the next game is a Stockholm-Grunfeld played in the USSR versus rest of the world match, which Bent Larsen played, Bobby Fischer played, and all the major players. This is, I don't know which board, but sort of not the best players. Taimanov versus Ullman. And we have a Stockholm-Grunfeld where white plays bishop to g5 on move 4. And after knight e4 we have this bishop h4. Bishop f4 can also be played. But this is sort of a forced line, which after e3 gives white a strong center, and bishop to g7 is not as powerful because you basically have no targets. You don't have an easy way to break through. Another thing is after cd, queen d, cd. Here, Ullman didn't play the theoretical move. He played knight c6, which doesn't do much. The theoretical move is e6, however strange that may be. Now, of course, black has dark squared weaknesses, but he can play bishop to e7. He hasn't committed to bishop g7 yet. So rook b1, bishop e7, and bishop b5, bishop d7, knight d7. This has been played before. White is slightly better, but black should be able to hold. Knight c6 played in the game, and now bishop to b5, pinning the knight, bishop to d7, unpinning, knight f3, getting his last minor piece into play, and bishop to g7, which is a very suspicious move, but you can understand that black would like to develop, he would like to castle, and that's not easy to do without having played e6. So in this position, after white castles, black would love to just castle, but if he castles, then bishop takes e7, and if knight takes e7, bishop takes d7. So you drop the e7 pawn. Another option could have been knight a5, but after bishop e2, you still... Okay, let me just put that on the board. After knight a5, bishop e2, you still either have to play e6 or f6 before you can castle. And if you keep your king in the center, that's not the end of the world, but why is black's knight on a5? Why does white have two open files? And white has very active bishops, whereas the g7 bishop doesn't really do much. So in this position, white is already better. Black's weakness is obvious, the e7 pawn and the king in the center. And he has to make further concessions to develop. So he plays e6. And after e6, you're not dropping a pawn anymore, but now you have additional weaknesses. The two major weaknesses in the black position, which were provoked by white simply playing good moves, are the bad d7 bishop and the dark squares, which are just horrible. So rook a b1, the b7 pawn is another weakness, so you have to do something about that. Not immediately, but very soon. So castles, finally. Knight to d2, and now the knight is preparing to get to b3, trying to get his pieces towards the queen side and target the weaknesses on b7, and also try to restrain the knight from jumping into a5, and also looking at the c5 square, which is a dark square, which is weak, which is not easy to defend for black. And you can see that the dark squared weaknesses are permanent, and black has no way to defend them. The bishop on h4 is controlling everything. The knight, by transferring from d2 to b3 to either c5 or a5, is also doing a great job on the dark squares. And here black goes crazy. What he should have done is a6, and after bishop e2, knight a5, trying to defend. But he played f5, and now, okay, it's easy to defend laterally. You have stuff like rook f7, but now e6 becomes an additional weakness. And of course, it wasn't easy to play this position for black. But by creating another weakness, his position is now almost lost. Knight b3. Of course, jumping into c5. Now you have to do something. If you play rook a to c8, getting to the open file, then knight c5 simply wins the pawn. So b6, fine, have to play b6. Now, what's the next weakness? b7 has been defended. The c5 square, which was a huge weakness, has been defended. Now the c6 knight is weak, so rook f to c1. And we have rook a to c8, bishop a6. Now the light squares on the queen side are weak. So white didn't really do much to create weaknesses. His very natural play made black create them himself. And this is probably how strong grandmasters win their games. They don't do anything, and then the weaker player creates a weakness, and then they target it and exploit it until they win. And also a very instructive point in this game is that white wasn't afraid to trade weaknesses. Sometimes the most obvious example is you have an extra pawn, but you trade it for time or for quality or whatever else. In this position, white traded probably 10 different weaknesses in black's position. Rook c to e8, of course the rook was attacked. Bishop to b7, now double attacking the knight. Knight to d8, and now the c6 knight is no longer weak because it's no longer on c6. But something else has been weakened by the move knight to d8, and that's the 7th rank, so rook to c7. And now it's already very hard to defend the black position. Rook f7 defending, but black's pieces are all on the first 2 ranks. The pawns have moved from the 7th rank. With the move f5, the 7th rank became very weak, so bishop a6. Bishop to a4, attacking the knight and wanting to trade the rooks. Rook bc1, you don't want to take on f7. Bishop f8, getting his bishop to a better diagonal. Of course, it was useless on g7. And now Mark Taimanov made a mistake. You have more space, you have more active pieces, you have weaknesses in your opponent's position you don't want to trade. In this position, he should have played rook 7 to c4, and after something like bishop e7, wanting to trade the bishops, again decline the trade. And after, let's say, b5, rook c8, and the knight is pinned. So after, let's say, bishop to a3, rook c7, bishop takes c7, and now black would be forced to defend for the rest of the game, probably losing. After bishop e7, knight c5, and this is unbearable. The e6 pawn is hanging. Everything is weak. The bishop on a4 is not doing anything. But Mark Taimanov was kind, and he played rook 1 to c4, allowing a trade. So rook c7, knight c6, and bishop to c4 played, targeting the e6 weakness. Bishop to g7 played, and now he went for a liquidation, which allowed him to equalize. He should have kept the pressure in the position. He played rook c8, which gives black an almost equal position. He managed to win because he was more precise and because black's position is just weak, but there were better options. Here I would like to stop, of course, after rook c8, bishop e6. But I think that if he hadn't traded pieces, he would have had a much easier position to play, and the weaknesses would have been more exploitable. But I still think that his play was very good up to that point. So after knight c6, which is a weird move, bishop b5 pinning the knight, bishop d7, now knight f3 developing the piece, bishop g7 is a mistake. Castles, and now black's position is just weak. White played very natural moves, and black's position is weak. So I think these two examples were quite instructive. I hope you got something from them. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. If you have any good examples of strong players or weak players provoking weaknesses, please share them. And again, my advice is study the openings you play and look for patterns strong players go for to create weaknesses. There are ways to create weaknesses in basically any opening. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Hope you got something from the video, and see you next Thursday. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.